During the worst days of the Civil War, the story is told that President Lincoln would have an aide with him but would go to church services on Wednesday night. That there was something about that Wednesday night service that was good for him to be able to sit, regather his thoughts, comfort his soul. When you look at the status of our country at that particular time, that seems easy to understand. We also know from that particular time personally that Lincoln had lost his son, so these were difficult days for him, not just as a leader, but also as a father. And so on one particular Wednesday night, the preacher had gotten up and presented his lesson. He got through, and people were standing up from the pew. They were making their way out. And as they did, Lincoln too got up, got that classic top hat of his, and as he stepped out of the pew, the aide asked him what he thought about the lesson that night. And this is what Lincoln had to say. He said, "I thought the sermon was carefully thought out, eloquently delivered." And so the aide added, "So you think that that was a great sermon, right, Mr. President?" And to that Lincoln responded, "No. In fact, I thought he failed because he did not ask of us something great." That Lincoln listened to that sermon that night, and even though it had been well prepared, well presented, he said that the preacher failed because the preacher didn't ask the church to do something great. Tonight, I don't know how I will do in trying to accomplish that task, but we are looking at a story in the book of Esther where Mordecai asks his cousin Esther, challenges his cousin Esther to do something great. So we're going to make our way to that. That's really the highlight of the story in chapter 4. But let's start off in chapter 1. Esther chapter 1, Xerxes is king of Persia at that particular time. And there's a couple of things that we know about Xerxes. Xerxes liked to party. He liked to show off his wealth. He liked to show off and boast of that which he had. And on this particular occasion, he had thrown a party and had invited a lot of people to come. And Scripture says some 6 days or so into this, I love the term there, is that he was high in spirits from the wine. I'll let you interpret that as you need to, right? And at that particular time, also the queen at the time, Vashti, had been hosting her own party as well. But as it entered this 6th day or so, King Xerxes called for his queen Vashti because Scripture says that she was lovely to look at. She's a beautiful lady. And he wanted her to come in so that he could show her off to the crowd. Again, he liked to demonstrate his power, to show off his power, his possessions, his wealth. And that even included his wife. But Vashti refused to come. And the king, Scripture says, was filled with anger, that he was furious and he was angry. And so the question was asked, because she had chosen not to come, and so the question was asked, well, how does the king respond when the queen doesn't do what the king asked? And so Xerxes went and he asked some of his companions, some of his advisors, his counselors. He said, what should I do? And their counsel to him was this: you need to banish her from the kingdom. You don't ever want her in front of your sight again, because if they see that can happen, the queen can get away with that with the king, what's that going to mean for the rest of the country? And so Vashti was banished from the palace. Never saw the king again. And there's a vacancy. Because you see, in Esther chapter 1, there's really no room for Esther. But now there is. So the possibility exists. And so the search is on for this new queen. That leads us to chapter 2. That's when we're introduced to Esther. We're also introduced to Mordecai. Now, the relationship between Mordecai and Esther is an interesting one. As far as just true blood relations, they're cousins. But Scripture tells us that it's a much deeper relationship than that. Because the relationship that they enjoyed was one really of Mordecai in a parent role. Because both of Esther's parents had passed away. And so Mordecai saw this opportunity, so he helped prepare Esther for this opportunity to become the queen of the land. And to make the long story short, she was chosen. But one thing that we find out, I believe it's about in Danny, maybe chapter 2, verse 20 thereabout, is that Esther kept her nationality a secret. That she didn't want the king to know who she was. Also in chapter 2, before the story ends, we learn something about Mordecai and his relationship to Xerxes. Let's go ahead and read that. We're in chapter 2, beginning in verse 21. During that time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. And all this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. That statement will prove very important later in the story. Chapter 3, we're introduced to the villain. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of higher honor than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay honor to him. And man, you talk about something that gets under somebody's skin in a hurry. Haman, the picture that I leave with Haman throughout the story is that Haman got a little bit of attention. He got a little bit of honor. He got a little bit of power. And it just inflated his ego. And so when he went out and everybody else is bowing down to him, Mordecai's not going to have anything to do with that. And Haman was furious. So much so that he goes and he prepares this plot, not just to get rid of Haman, although Haman is probably man number one on his list. Haman's content at that point to exterminate all the Jews in the land. Again, let's appreciate the timetable here. This is at the time of the exile, and people are going back to Jerusalem, but everybody's not going back to Jerusalem. Remember, this takes place in waves. And so there are a lot of Jews left still in the land of Persia. And so here Haman is now in a condition, in a situation where what Mordecai has done has led Haman to put together this plot, not just to get rid of Haman, not just to get rid of Mordecai, but to get rid of all of the Jews as well. You know, sometimes, James, when you mistype a name in your notes and you keep thinking, boy, I hope I don't do this when I get ready to present it, here we are, all right? So I don't need any reminders of that tomorrow. Esther chapter 4. Esther, queen. Xerxes, king. Mordecai, good guy. Haman, bad guy. We're good, right? Chapter 4. This gives us an idea of the picture of Mordecai's response to this plot that has been put into place. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. Now, this is interesting because even at that point, Esther finds out that Mordecai is outside. He's got on sackcloth and ashes. Esther even sends a suit of clothes out to him, saying, take that stuff off, put on something nice to wear. Mordecai won't have anything to do with it because Mordecai's devastated. And this is a way, the whole idea of sackcloth and ashes, this is tremendous mourning that is taking place. And he is wailing. His heart is broken. His heart is stirred. Now, also keep in mind, though, chapter 2, verse 20, that Esther had not let her nationality be known. And so there is this dialogue that takes place. It's almost like writing notes and shifting them back and forth, of where Mordecai sends this message to Esther saying, don't you understand what's about to happen? Esther, you need to do something. And Esther sends back a message saying, what do you want me to do? I can't just do this. I can't just go to the king. And there's a couple of reasons she couldn't go to the king. First of all, she hadn't let her nationality be known. Anybody remember what the second reason is? That's right, the king didn't ask for it. You could only go into the king's presence when the scepter was pointed toward you, when you were given permission. You were requested to be in front of the king. And that's when we get to what is the classic line of the whole book. Esther chapter 4, beginning in verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. I guess this is as good a time as any to talk about one of the interesting points of Esther. What is not found in the book of Esther? The name of God. It's not there. The providence of God is throughout the book, but the name of God is not there. But this statement reminds us as Mordecai is going through and he's saying, look, you've got an opportunity to do something great. But if you don't do it, somebody will. But you are in a position to do something great. So there, Mordecai has challenged Esther to do something great. How would she respond? She didn't necessarily just go straight to the king and say, here we are, here's what the need is, here's what's going on. Her response and the plan that she puts into place is incredibly wise. Chapter 5, let's start in verse 1. On the third day, by the way, on the third day, you know what that tells me? Everything, even when it's urgent, doesn't have to be handled right here, right now. Give things an opportunity for wisdom to play, to give the time for prayer to work its way. And one of the things that, one of my phrases, I guess it's a life phrase of mine now because I've used it longer than a week, is that your urgent doesn't have to become my urgent. Because if I'm going to do something wise, sometimes I need time to pray, to think, and to study that through. And so I think that this is a great, just that one statement for us. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her, and he held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." This banquet is really, as I read through this, is to prepare for a banquet that will be held tomorrow. And so that's the whole point, is let's gather everybody today just so a proper invitation can be shared for you to come back to this banquet the next day. Now, so Haman finds out that there's going to be a banquet, and the only two guests of honor are the king and him. Now, for somebody with an inflated ego, what happens then? Man, that head won't fit in a room, right? And that's exactly the way Haman responds. Boy, he goes home, he gets out of there, And then the first person he sees is Haman. And what does Haman not do? Sorry. See, there I go again. Can't say anything tomorrow, though. We're dealing with this now. All right, so what? Esther's the queen. Xerxes is the king. Mordecai is the good guy, and Haman's the bad guy. Got it? I don't, but y'all do. If y'all do, we're good. All right, so Haman, his ego is inflated. He goes out, and the first thing he sees is Mordecai. And what is the one thing that Mordecai doesn't do? He doesn't bow down. And so somebody with an inflated ego then, and you just thought that Mordecai was upset. This is such a good lesson too. Man, I hope y'all are hanging in there in spite of this. Haman's got this inflated ego. He's already mad at Mordecai. And now he's furious. And so Haman goes home. And you know what he does? He has him go ahead and build gallows. He goes ahead. He knows he's going to get rid of Mordecai, and he's prepared to hang him. So he's already getting everything ready. And then chapter 6 begins. Things begin to fall apart here, by the way. Chapter 6, verse 1. That night the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? The king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. Now, so this is where, again, the story starts to fall apart, because the king calls in Haman, and he says, when somebody does something good for what should be done for him? And I love chapter 6, verse 9, because it's there that this idea is presented that someone should be led down the street, this proclamation being made. This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. And the king said, that's a great idea, Haman. Go grab Mordecai and lead him down the street. He's angry. He's humiliated. Things just aren't going well. And he gets home. Remember, he's still got a banquet to attend. But he gets home and he's telling his advisors, he's telling his wife this, and even his closest advisors and his wife, if you'll look at what they tell him, they said, you will surely come to ruin. They're even already telling, by the way, this isn't going to work out for you. We don't know what exactly is going to happen, but this isn't going to end well for you. Now, Haman didn't even have time to sort all of this out before, next thing you know, the king's men have come to bring Haman to the banquet. Chapter 7, verse 3. Remember, the king had asked Esther, what is it that you want? Up to half of my kingdom. And so now she's ready to answer that question. Chapter 7, verse 3. The queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he, the man who dared to do such a thing? And Esther said, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. And then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. We look just a few verses later, and by the end of this chapter, Haman has been hanged on the very gallows that he had prepared to kill Mordecai on. But there's still a problem, because Haman had this plot, and the wheels were already turning now. And so then we have what turns into this great story. Esther and Mordecai asked the king for permission to defend themselves. Chapter 8, verse 11. The king's edict, this is going to be ultimately the king's ruling. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so that the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. Now, as we read through again in the next few verses, what we find out is that this one day for which they had asked, they come back to the king and they ask for a second day. And so this effort of protection falls quickly into a 2-day event. Esther chapter 9, verse 12. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What they have done in the rest of the king's provinces. What have they done? Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will be granted." "If it pleases the king," Esther answered, "give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also. And let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles." Those actions were carried out by the Jews throughout the land as they defended themselves. Now, as we come to the end of the book, chapter 9, just a few verses in chapter 10, what we find out from a Jewish perspective, from this Old Testament perspective, is that this whole story is told and it's accounted, it's put into history to help them understand the importance of celebrating a festival, a holiday, a day to remember. It's the Feast of Purim, P-U-R-I-M. It's the Feast of Purim that will be celebrated year after year as a reminder of the actions of this brave woman to save the people that were in Persia at that particular time. Chapter 9, verse 20. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the province of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Mordecai challenged Esther to do something great. You know, the Bible is filled with stories like that, of where men were challenged, women were challenged to do something great. Like Noah building an ark. Like Moses leading a nation out of Egypt, out of slavery. Like Joshua taking down the city of Jericho. Or like we talked about briefly this morning about David taking down a giant. What I also find interesting in Scripture, though, is to note this, that Scripture is filled with this time where people do small things that God can use as great things. There's the boy who shared a small lunch of 5 loaves and 2 fish. There's the story of a woman that met Jesus at the well. And she went back to town, and the only thing that she told him is, "Come out and hear this man." And an entire community was changed. And so whether it was 5,000 people being fed, whether it was an entire community being changed, it was somebody that did something that at that time could have seemed so small. But God took that and He used it for something great. And in this story today, we have a man that had helped Esther get into this position. He had taken her in his home. He had prepared her for this moment. And so when that time of crisis came, he turned to her and he looked to her. And he says, but who knows but that you've been put into this position for such a time as this. He didn't ask her to do anything that he didn't think she was capable of doing. Mordecai knew Esther. He had helped prepare her for this moment. And so now he was challenging her to do something great. I find it very interesting in chapter 4, one visit there and we're done, that in chapter 4 of how easy it would have been for Esther to just say no. Why not? I can think of a lot of different reasons. A lot of those would be the same reasons that we would give today when we're asked to do something for the Lord in this place at this time. You know, there's a lot of studies out of things that people fear. Whether it's the fear of failure, the fear of commitment, the fear of trusting others, the fear of speaking publicly, the fear of not getting names right in a sermon. Oh, I'm sorry, that one's on me. The fear of being alone. But we have all of these reasons that we might fear and say no rather than say yes. But I'm reminded of two things. I'm reminded of what we have shared tonight. But who knows that we have come to this time and this place to do something great. So maybe that door of opportunity that's available for us, that God has been working to prepare us, the people that have been put in our path to help prepare us to do great things at this time. Whether it be big or small. Man, God's the one that takes the effort and blesses it regardless. Then I also think about all these passages in Scripture that we continue to run through that say, do not fear. Don't be afraid. Church, we don't have a reason to be afraid. Not when we come to God. And not when we put our faith in Jesus. You remember when you were baptized into Christ? What night was it? Saturday night. Had to go from Locust to Hampton to find a... I remember Danny telling me that story. The baptistry wasn't ready, so they had to do that. Mine was on a Tuesday night. The little church building that out in the country was packed. It is something I talked over with my parents. We'd sat down and studied. I knew what I wanted to do, but it was so interesting that night because it seemed like the building had never been so full before. But when that song started, I knew what I wanted to do. That was an opportunity, that one step, to put me on a path to do something for God. To put my faith in Jesus, that wherever I walked, to know that my desire was to please Him. It takes courage. It takes commitment. Most of us here tonight have made that step. We've made that commitment. God bless us for that. But if you haven't, I encourage you to strongly consider that. But then I think about these opportunities around us every day. For those of us that are Christians, the opportunity we have to do something good, be it big or be it small, but the opportunity to do something for God. Oh, and I pray that when that time comes, whether it be tonight, tomorrow, this week, or next month, I pray that we have the courage of Esther. I pray we exercise wisdom in the same way that she did. Not just to say that we did it, but that we did it in a way that we sought the Lord's guidance and we did something that was wise, that led to those great results. To put ourselves in a position for God to work in us and through us to do great things. Perhaps tonight our opportunity and our need is to come to Christ. Perhaps for others it's to make sure that we commit ourselves to being about the Lord's business and to seek out those opportunities. Because who knows that we have come to this time and this place to do something good for God.